Hello, welcome to revision session 17. This one is on emergency parachute systems. I'm going to start out with a short history. Back in the late 70s, early 80s, hang gliding became very popular, but there were a few incidents and accidents where people had structural failure, or there were even a couple of mid-air collisions. And so the use of emergency parachutes started to come in. In the early days, they were pretty heavy and pretty large things, and the hang glider pilots carried them on their chest so they could get up with either hand. And pretty soon they were proving their worth. A few people's lives were saved by them. With paragliding, there is a much greater chance than with a hang glider, which of course has a rigid structure, of something going wrong. So in the early days of paragliding, where we were having pilots who are sometimes spinning, sometimes stalling, or of course getting asymmetric collapses primarily, where the use of emergency parachutes became pretty widespread. So virtually everybody, apart from a few speed flyers, started to carry an emergency parachute system. And every year since it's been happening, there have been a number of deployments which have saved people's lives. So they're basically a good thing, really. And okay, the next thing I want to talk about is size of chute, because there has been some debate about this, and everybody these days is very keen not to carry anything larger or heavier than they can get away with. So new materials have made them significantly lighter, and pilots are always keen, of course, to carry something quite small, but it has to be of sufficient size. Because the EN certification requires a sink rate of no more than 5.5 meters per second with the maximum payload. Basically, if you buy any emergency parachute which has the proper EN certification, you should be fine as long as you're within the weight range. You may come across, probably unlikely now, but you may just come across an older emergency parachute which has DHV certification. So the DHV, which is the German one, they had a slightly higher rate. They allowed 6.8 meters per second, which frankly is quite likely to break a leg on that. And so if it's only got DHV certification, then the recommendation from the BHPA and other bodies is that you only fly up to 75% of the payload of the emergency parachute. Right, talk about payload. When you work out what your load in flight, maximum load in flight, that means everything. That is the emergency parachute itself, your harness, helmet, basically everything that leaves the ground. So if your body weight is, say, 80 kilos, and then you've got all your kit, you're probably going to be weighing something like 95 kilos as far as your load on an emergency parachute is concerned. So the main thing is don't get one that's too small. I'm occasionally asked, can I get one that's too big? The answer is yes, but it's not easy. If you get something that is really huge and you're flying it in, say, a tandem emergency parachute, and you're flying it in ridge lift, then when you're coming down, it's all about how hard you hit the ground. And of course, that's partly vertical, but also if you're coming down really gently in wind, you might be going horizontally at quite a speed as well. So to some extent, we want to come down fairly steeply. So if you've got a massive emergency parachute and you're floating down like thistledown, sounds good, but you may very well get a bit of lateral movement as well. It's not usually a problem unless you're grossly underweight for an emergency parachute. So stay within the weight range is obviously the advice. But if I had one that was slightly too big for me, I was slightly under the weight range, I wouldn't be too concerned about it. Types. There are a bewildering variety of designs out there. The standard kind of, you can see the top picture here is Mayday. There are many emergency parachutes of this kind of pulled apex design, which is basically circular with the center pulled down. And this is to get the maximum coefficient of drag from the smallest area in a nice simple package. Hundreds and hundreds of these type of emergency parachutes have been deployed very successfully. So they're very efficient, and I say they're easy to repack. However, they do have some issues. One of them is that they can oscillate sometimes and spill the air out the side, so they come down like this, which isn't very good. In certain cases, they've done something called coning, which is where they, like putting ice cream on a cone where they've got to swirl around. And it's all about dumping the load when they're under high pressure. So some other designs have come in. The squares, you can see another picture of squares. Squares tend to be a little bit more stable and come down a little bit, less likely to oscillate. So they're basically a good thing. And they're not too difficult to repack either. They're not too much of a hassle, so it's a reasonable option. But they're still not perfect, and they don't have the sink rate of Regalo parachutes, which is like the twin cone design. I'll show you a picture in just a second, which have a fabulous sink rate, and that's partly because they're moving forward as well, flying. But that does introduce some other issues as well. Okay, so there's those basic types. There are always new ones. I've seen you can do a triangular one, which is not actually a square, but it's not a Regalo. It doesn't have that shape. It just has to be a triangular shape. There's pentagonal ones, so that you get one point is opposite one flat area to try and minimize oscillation. There are different options, and some have slight advantages over others in the amount of coefficient of drag, but there is no perfect design. Basically, if they are all the right size for you and they're deployed with enough room, they will all work fine. What you do have to have is a system that's compatible with the kind of flying and the harness you're going to do. If you are an aerobatic pilot, for example, so you think there's a moderate chance that at some point you're going to destroy your glider in midair or fall into it, then you may want to have some kind of cutaway system. So there are base type systems that work really well, but although they are more expensive and heavy to carry. And so basically most pilots will make a decision depending on their budget and what kind of flying they're likely to do. But the reserve needs to be, the emergency parachute needs to be compatible with your harness as well. And that depends on a number of things. It depends on the size of it, the shape of the container, which I'm going to touch on in just a moment, and how it connects. And then finally, it's repacking. As mentioned earlier, Regalos have probably the best performance in terms of sink rate of any of the emergency parachute systems, but some pilots are put off because they're a bit more challenging to repack themselves. If you're prepared to pay to have it sent away and repacked professionally, then that's absolutely fine. But if you want to repack it yourself, especially if you're doing it in a car park or something like that, then which has been known between flights, then you might not consider that to be the best idea. Okay. Packing, that's repacking, putting the thing back into its bag, is not usually an issue because they most have good manuals, they have good packing instructions. A lot of people have it done professionally anyway, or at least get someone experienced to oversee it. However, installation, that's putting it into your harness, is something that has thrown up quite a few issues in recent years. So the common issues that we find with installing emergency parachutes are trying to fit a big reserve into a small container, and therefore there's too much pressure on the pins and they either give or they can't get it out. Interestingly, if you try and put a small parachute into a large container, that can also have issues. Sometimes they try and turn around and get jammed. So that can be a problem as well. And some people have to put little bits of packing in to make sure they fit properly. Or if it doesn't fill the container, the retaining pins, some kind of retaining pins, rely on the pressure to stay in place. So if there is no pressure, because it's slack, they can fall out. So the retaining pins and wires must be firmly seated, and this can be an issue with certain combinations. Okay, Velcro and zippers. Very often the system is underneath the back, underneath the seat or on the back, and there are various sort of leaves you'll be aware of that all has to go together. And to stop them flapping around, to make them look tidy, manufacturers use bits of Velcro. Unfortunately, Velcro, as it gets older, there's two things that can happen to it. The first one, if it gets dragged on the ground and gets bits of mud or dirt or grass, anything like that in it, then it becomes less effective and they start to open by themselves with just a nudge. The opposite problem is also when you get a couple of bits of Velcro and you stick it together and you leave it there for a year or two, when you try and peel it apart, it can actually give an awful lot of resistance to that. So suddenly, when you need to get your parachute out in a hurry, you can find that if you have a lot of Velcro to rip, it can be difficult to do. Therefore, Velcro is, I won't say it's a bad idea because it's useful in small quantities. You need to be very careful that you're not overdoing it with Velcro. And finally, the hook element of Velcro must never be able to be in contact with either the lines or the fabric of the parachute itself, because obviously it's very abrasive and can damage those. Zippers, very often the area where the bridle goes up the side of the harness or where it comes out, they use some kind of zip fastening and the zip opens as you go. Absolutely fine, it's great, but zippers, as we all know, if you damage one, If you crush it up or you break it and you lose a tooth, then they keep opening, or they can get jammed. So it's important that these are checked as well, that they're in good condition. Right, the harness leaves, I'm just talking here about the flaps that cross. It's important they're in the right order. It is possible sometimes, if you put them in the wrong order, to then have real problems getting the reserve out of its container. So it's just a packing issue. It must be packed correctly, simple as that. And finally, the handle position and fixing. It doesn't actually matter where the handle of your emergency parachute is, as long as you can find it. But in stress situations, human beings will always tend to go down to their hip here. There's been a number of bits of research done on this. So if it's somewhere else, if it's a bit further down or a bit further up, then people flail around looking for it. So the important thing is not where it is, but that you look to see where it is, and so you can put your hand on it. If you're looking up at a wrecked paraglider and pulling around, people have pulled bits of their speed bar and all kinds of stuff when they're looking for the emergency parachute handle. So important that we get it located. And then finally, bridles and connectors. The bridles have to be probably routed up the right way. There's been all sorts of systems where a bridle has gone around somebody's neck, or it's gone inside a speed bar line, so they've been hanging from one hip as they've come down. And the connectors at the shoulders have to be the right sort. You can't have thin bits of nylon webbing going into thick bits of polyester webbing, for example, or it might melt through in a shock. So you ought to have metal, or you should have some kind of approved connector where that kind of heat and pressure is not going to cause a problem. And obviously your connectors must be done up. There's been more than one case where someone's emergency parachute has been bought in for a repack. I've had a look at it and the connectors have not actually been done up. Not much good there. So that's making sure it's in all right. Now we're actually talking about flying, the decision to deploy an emergency parachute. Basically, sometimes you are high and you have a problem like a big collapse, or it starts to spin, or in midair, and you've got time to think about it. And that's fine. You can see if you can regain control. Those of you done an advanced glider control course will have a good idea of this. And I strongly recommend those to anybody. It just gives you more confidence in what you can do with your paraglider and what you can recover from, and gives you the knowledge of what you can't recover from. However, if you have lost control, in other words, it's turning and diving and you can't stop it, or it's doing something like pitching, it's stalled and it pitches forward and you're losing, you can't control it, it's absolutely crucial that you monitor your height. If you're thousands of feet high, that's fine. You can have a bit of a chance at playing around with it. But if you're losing height and you get within 500 feet of the ground, so that's 150 meters, just over 150 meters, you must deploy your emergency parachute. Why? Well, if you get a collapse and the glider turns, it is quite common for your glider, as it starts to auto rotate, to accelerate, and you'd be losing height very quickly. 6 meters per second is not untypical with just half a paraglider. So you lose a 50%, starts to turn, 6 meters per second. So at 150 meters high, that gives you 25 seconds to impact. It sounds like quite a long time, but considering it's going to take you a few seconds to decide, and then you've got to pull your parachute out, and then you've got to throw it, and then it's got to deploy, it's not a very big margin. And of course, if your glider pitches nose down and auto rotates in a spiral dive, which it can do after a big collapse or something like that, very quickly, you're suddenly looking at 12-15 meters per second. So whatever that is, 6 or 7 seconds to impact from 500 feet. So 500 feet, I would say 150 meters, anything below that where you're not in control of your glider, you need to deploy your emergency parachute straight away. And that's assuming that you're pretty practiced at doing it and you can do it pretty smoothly. So how do we deploy? Well, as mentioned earlier, one of the issues is people can't find the handle. So the first thing to do is look, have a look. It doesn't matter what you do with your brakes because you're not going to need those. So I hear sometimes think about, oh, pass one brake into another hand. Frankly, it doesn't really matter. So let go of your brake, or whichever brake you're going to do. Look, find your handle, go down, put your hand, grab it, pull it out, and hopefully pull it out and deploy all in one movement. Occasionally pilots have pulled it out, they don't have much momentum, so they try and swing across their body, and unfortunately if the lines come out over here, at that point the parachute falls over and they've got lines all over the place. So I wouldn't go across your body at all, just pull it out and chuck it. Even if it's a weak throw, because you've got forward airspeed, it'll very soon go to line stretch and it will open. Even if you just drop it, it will work. So that's it's look, grab, throw, all in one movement if you can. Don't hang on to it. It's no good to you on your lap. Okay, so little pictures here. These were taken on a zip wire while some members of the Cumbrian soaring club, paragliding club, were practicing on a zip wire. So this pilot here had a little GoPro camera hooked up, and you see here he's looking, seeing his handle. Next one is grabbing. See, he's got hold of it, good grip on there, and in fact he's grabbing and looking at the same time. So he's looking out and he's making sure the space he's throwing into is clear. So having found it, he's looking out and then throw. So there goes the arm and still looking where it's going. Normally you would reach down, grab and throw. The only time you wouldn't do that is if your paraglider is over there. If you're in a diving turn to the right and your paraglider is down there, then you would pull out and try and go somewhere else, throw it into space, preferably back that way. Doesn't really matter, assuming you're going to be going that way. You want to throw it ahead rather than behind. However, that's the procedure. Look, grab, throw, and then check that it's gone. If it goes out to the end but doesn't actually deploy, and this has happened a few times, people put a lot of rubber bands on, or let's say you're spinning and you don't have much forward speed and it just follows you down, you might have to give it a bit of a yank to help it to deploy. Okay, so that is the deployment procedure. It's really easy when you're practiced and ready for it. It's like any show, you know, the more you rehearse, the better you are when it comes to the big night. So what you need to do, and this is now part of, since 2020, we're putting it into the club pilot syllabus now, is everybody has an emergency parachute should have a practice at getting out so they know where it is. So that means probably sitting in a static hangar of some description, you know, pretending you're in trouble and thinking, okay, look, grab, throw, and just get used to how much force it takes to pull out and where you can throw it. Do that 2 or 3 times, and when it actually happens to you, if it actually happens to you, you'll find it much easier to do. Even better, if you can, is to use a zip wire. If your club has a thing where you actually have a repack thing where you can actually be sliding along and you're spinning around trying to think of something else, and then you have to go for it, obviously that's very much closer to reality. In the pictures I showed earlier at the Cumbrian Club, everybody had they put dummy reserves in the systems, so everybody had like 3 goes, and everybody by the 3rd attempt was much slicker and much faster, you know, measurably faster than they were the first time. So practice makes perfect, obviously. So make sure that's you. The other thing about preparation is obviously mental preparation. It's not just knowing where it is, but when you are flying, having at the back of your mind that if it all goes to worms, you will deploy your reserve parachute. You shouldn't be thinking, oh, what should I do now? Oh yes, I've got an emergency parachute. That's too slow. You're just straight for it. You should be aware that it's there all the time. And the final way of practicing, of course, is to actually do it live. So sometimes pilots go on advanced glider control courses over water, and they choose to deploy their emergency parachute. I have to say I've got very mixed feelings about this. The first one is if you do it over salt water, and the parachute obviously you're going to land in the water, so you get salt in it. The salt crystals do actually weaken the fabric, and they when it dries out inside the stitch lines and the weave of the fabric, so it actually reduces the effective life of your emergency parachute. So that's a big consideration, apart from UV light and all the rest of it, and dragging it out of the water into a boat. If you do it over fresh water, that's not too bad. If you do it over salt water, sorry, you should rinse it down with fresh water afterwards to minimize the salt contamination. If you do it over fresh water, then fair enough, it will tell you what it's like to come down. But again, landing in water is quite a risky thing to do. So you could have other issues concerned with getting tangled up. You can't do a downwind landing or anything like the sort of advice I gave you when we talked about water landings in an earlier session. So you all come down in a heap with you, the paraglider and the reserve. And that is a potentially dangerous situation. So my personal view, which not everybody agrees with, is the risks outweigh the benefits. Something like a zip wire is a nice safe way of doing it without having any of those risks. Okay. Repacking. Emergency parachute should be repacked regularly. Now some manufacturers say every 6 months, some say every year. It depends how much you use it and what sort of abuse it gets. If your harness gets very damp, or you've been flying a great deal and it's been dragged around or whatever, or you've been sitting on it and squashing it down, then a little bit more often is obviously a good idea. Certainly if it's come out a bit or whatever and you think it's actually got wet, then it needs to be repacked. Most pilots do it once a year. It's a bit like the MOT on the car. They get their glider surfaced and they get their emergency parachute repacked. So you can do it yourself. There are online tutorials for most of these, and you get a manual with your emergency parachute. People are rightly a little bit wary of this because they don't want to get it wrong. It's obviously a crucial thing, but they're pretty good, the manuals, and a competent person, if they've given a nice flat clean area and plenty of time, can manage it okay. However, certainly for the first time, I would make sure there's someone else there, as a second pair of eyes, looking over your shoulder, checking the manual and saying, oh, do you know what, I don't think you should leave that carabiner in there, or whatever it may be. Certainly if you've got a more complex system, like a base system or a regalo, it's really important to get help to help you do it. People who've done it before, there's a few little tricks you can pick up to make it much easier. Right. The other way, of course, is to send it away. There are plenty of professional parachute repackers, and in order to use one of those, you should check that they have, in the UK, they've got the BHPA Emergency Packers license, which is really important. That means they've been on a course, they've been checked out, and they've been examined repacking various different models of emergency parachute. Be aware, some of those repackers may not be familiar with some less common reserve types, but they will have the basics and they should be able to follow the manual okay, because they've done similar things before. They all work on basically the same principle. If you are going to do that, don't take out your emergency parachute and send it off, although that's a temptation. I would strongly recommend that the whole harness goes, because as mentioned earlier, it isn't the packing of the emergency parachute that's usually the issue, it's the installation. So really what you want is for somebody to repack it, put it in the deployment bag, and then put the deployment bag in your harness and check the whole system works. Practice deploying it before they put it back in again and give it back to you. That's my advice anyway. Okay. All right, we've got to the end of it now. I hope that's given you some information on emergency parachutes. The most important thing to take away from this is that people have been killed when they've got perfectly good emergency parachutes on board because they've delayed too long in throwing them. So the takeaway message is, if it all goes to worms, chuck it out. Okay, I hope that's been useful.